unit on the Cold War, but since we're just doing it in one day, I'm going to condense it and take out a lot of the details. Now, what was the Cold War? It was more or less a conflict between communism and democracy, or socialism and capitalism. On one side, it was led by the Soviet Union. On the other side, it was led by the United States. Now, this is going to span all the way from the mid-1940s at the end of World War II, all the way to the early 1990s. But it wasn't actually war. This was just kind of this heated conflict, this rivalry. Well, this actually kind of gets going before the Second World War is even over. There was a conference in Yalta. The leaders of the Allied nations, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, all got together and had this meeting. And it turned out that Stalin, when he was pushing the Germans out of Eastern Europe, he had taken over those countries, and he had intended on staying there and making those countries communist and controlling them. Winston Churchill called this an Iron Curtain, basically saying that Stalin was putting up this wall and holding these countries hostage. Now, these countries would become known as the Eastern Bloc countries, and for many decades, they wouldn't be able to control their own destinies. If they tried to start a revolution, the Soviet Union would quash it and say, no, you must remain communist. Well, this country of Germany, half of it falls in this Eastern Bloc. The eastern half becomes communist, the western half remains democratic. And the capital city of Berlin was in the eastern half. And so the city of Berlin itself gets divided into a western half that would be democratic and eastern half that would be communist. Well, Stalin kind of pulls a sneaky move, and he cuts off the city of Berlin. He blocks off the roads so that the Allied forces cannot get supplies and food into the democratic half, western half of Berlin. So the Allies need to figure out a solution to this, and they did not want to provoke the Soviet Union into an outright war. So they start flying planes in that were parachuting in like boxes of cereal and toothpaste and those basic supplies the people in Western Berlin needed. Now, something else that happens right after the Second World War is in Italy. It looked like Italy, after they had killed Mussolini and chopped off his head, it looked like they were going to elect a communist government. The United States was very scared of this happening. So the CIA had one of their first missions. What they did was they had church pastors give sermons and scare their congregations into what's going to happen if Italy goes communist. The United States is going to cut off all economic aid to Italy. You won't, if you have relatives in Italy, you're not going to be allowed to be in contact with them anymore. You won't be allowed to send them any money. And so many Italians who lived in the United States wrote letters to their relatives in Italy and said, look, you can't vote for the communist government. We won't even be able to talk to each other anymore. We won't be able to send you any money. And as a result, even though it looked like the communists were going to win the election, they end up losing the election in Italy. Something else that happens after this, the CIA does another mission where they send jazz musicians to tour Europe. These were known as the jazz messengers. And the idea here was kind of to put a cover-up on the racism that was going on in the United States. Now, at this time, many southern states were still practicing racial segregation, where schools and churches and restrooms were racially segregated. Oftentimes, with the ones black people were forced to use were the inferior restrooms or schools or buildings or whatever. And the Soviet Union rightfully put down the United States and criticized the United States for this inherent racism. Well, the jazz messengers was to try and cover this up and say, look, we've got white and black jazz musicians playing together, creating this great art form that was invented here in the United States, and paid for them to go on tour in Europe to try to cover up that US racism that was very alive in the American South at the time. Another thing the United States did in Europe was called the Marshall Plan. A lot of countries in Europe were ravaged by World War II and needed to rebuild. And so the United States sent money over to these countries so that they could rebuild. But this was to try and take away the allure of communism and help boost up the allure of capitalism and democracy. Well, at the same time, after the Second World War in China, a guy named Mao Zedong ends up leading a revolution there. He defeats the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, who is forced to flee to Taiwan, and China becomes the second communist country in the world. Mao institutes a plan known as the Great Leap Forward. This is very similar to Stalin's 5-year plan, only way less successful. They try to increase the rice yield, the amount of rice crops being grown, but this ends up failing. They try to start industrialization, they try to start a steel industry, but they don't actually learn from any of the people who've had a steel industry. They just try to melt down the steel items they had imported, like old scissors or wheelbarrows or whatever, and they don't really know what they're doing, and they actually ruin most of these things and don't really create any usable steel. Well, the birds had been destroying some of their rice crops, so they decide they need to kill all the birds. And at this point, they actually are very successful. People were climbing in trees, smashing bird eggs. But once they had killed most of the birds in China, the insect populations exploded, and insects ravaged the crops even worse than the birds had. Well, something that happens not too much later is the Korean War. At the end of the Second World War, Korea had been divided into a northern half that would be Soviet-led and communist, and a southern half that would be democratic and led by the United States and the United Nations. Well, the dictator, the leader of North Korea, decides that he's not happy with the situation. He wants more. He wants to control all of Korea. So he invades South Korea, takes it over. The United States and the United Nations send in troops to help the South Koreans, and they're able to push these communist forces in North Korea almost all the way to the border with China. But at this point, the Chinese government gets scared of an invasion, so they send their own troops that push people further back into South Korea. The United States redoubles their efforts. Eventually, they're going to push them about to the middle of the Korean Peninsula, where the boundary had been drawn up at the end of the Second World War. And they're going to sign a peace treaty, dividing Korea into two halves that is going to be similar to what it was before, and it's what it is today, with North Korea being kind of a hermit nation and its citizens having no idea what's really going on in the rest of the world. Well, the space race was also happening at the same time. There were these Nazi scientists who were captured after the Second World War ended, and it turned out they had very great technology for starting a space program. The United States wasn't sure if they felt okay working with former Nazi scientists. The Soviet Union didn't care. They said, okay, cool. Well, the Soviet Union is going to lead the space race at first. They're going to send the first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik, followed by the first living creature, Laika, a dog sent into space, and the first human, a cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin. Eventually, the United States is going to kind of cozy up to these former Nazi scientists, and they're going to put the first humans on the moon. And that's going to effectively end the space race. But what was really more important than the space race is that same rocket technology that could send a ship into space could also be used to send a weapon across your enemy's borders. And so at the same time, the nuclear arms race is going on. We talked about the first two atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how deadly they were. Well, these same German scientists are going to help propel this technology even further. And it turns out that there were spies in the Manhattan Project, the people who developed those atomic bombs in the United States. Even though it was very, very top secret, there were some Soviet spies who managed to smuggle this information to the Soviet Union. There was a wife and husband, the Rosenbergs. They get executed once they're discovered as being these spies for the Soviet Union. At the time, people didn't know if they really were spies or not, and some people protested their execution. We'd only find out many decades later, once the Soviet Union fell, that it turns out from the Soviet documents they actually were Soviet spies. Well, the United States increases the technology. They move from atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, which were far bigger, far more powerful, far more deadly. And as the United States and the Soviet Union are both testing these bombs, they're releasing lots of radiation to the atmosphere. So it would get into the grass, which cows would eat, and it would get into the milk. And it turns out strontium-90, this radioactive isotope, was forming a bond in children's teeth and in their bones. It's very similar to calcium. So mothers got very worried about this eventually once they started to find out what was going on, which would take a while. The Kodak Film Company that made film for cameras, their film was being destroyed, and they didn't know why. They eventually found out it was because of this radiation from all of this nuclear bomb testing. Well, this would prompt the United States to detonate a bomb in outer space called Starfish Prime that would knock out all of the satellite communications and the power grid in Hawaii for a period of time. Something else that happened that kind of turned up the flames on the Cold War was called the U-2 incident. The United States had been sending these U-2 spy planes to fly over the Soviet Union and take photographs. Well, one of them crashes down. The pilot bails out, he ejects and parachutes down, but he's not able to escape the Soviets. He had a cyanide pill to poison himself with, but he does not end up taking it. The Soviets capture him. And this is a huge embarrassment for the United States. They try to deny it and cover it up, but they cannot. The U.S. gets caught spying. Well, in Cuba, they undergo a revolution led by a guy named Fidel Castro. He takes the country in a different direction. Cuba becomes communist, and the United States doesn't feel comfortable about this. Cuba's about 50 miles south from the state of Florida, and the United States takes a bunch of refugees, exiles, people who had fled Cuba, to go live in Florida after Fidel Castro took over. They take these people, the CIA does, they train them to fight, and they take them back to Cuba to try and overthrow Fidel Castro. Well, this is a colossal failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion, as it's known, absolutely fails, and all of these people get captured, and it's a big humiliation for the United States and the Kennedy administration. Well, the Soviet Union quickly becomes allies with communist Cuba. They try to store some nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the United States finds out about this from some spy planes, and they're not very happy about this. They demand that these nuclear weapons be removed. Well, once they're not removed, the United States sends some battleships to blockade the island of Cuba so that no traffic can come in or out. The Soviet Union demands that this blockade be removed, or else they're going to go to war with the United States. Well, they send their Navy, their submarines, their ships to the Caribbean. There's a big standoff. It almost causes a nuclear war. We found out many decades later in some declassified Soviet documents that there was a submarine that came very close to firing a nuclear torpedo in the United States that would have set off a nuclear war between the two countries. Thankfully, they did not. The United States and Cuba and the Soviet Union work out a peace agreement. The United States agrees they will never try to invade Cuba again, and the Soviet Union agrees to take those missiles out of Cuba. Now, the United States also actually had their own missiles stationed in places like Turkey and Italy that could have very easily struck upon the Soviet Union. So the United States is going to remove some of these missiles as well. Well, something else that happens is the Vietnam War. After the Second World War, Vietnam, similar to Korea, had been divided into two parts. The northern part that was communist and the southern part that was democratic. Now, there were supposed to be free elections, and it looked like a guy named Ho Chi Minh was going to win and be able to control all of the country. But these elections were stopped, and so people who supported Ho Chi Minh felt that they had been cheated. And these communist forces, these armies, start rising up and fighting to try and take over South Vietnam. Well, the United States gets involved. They start sending more and more and more and more troops to try and fight against the North Vietnamese. But this is a very difficult war. Vietnam had been a colony of China and France and Japan and France again, and they did not want outsiders coming in and trying to tell them what to do. Even if it was to try and stop communism, they felt like it was outsiders coming to control them. And so this type of fighting was in the jungle. It was called guerrilla warfare. And it was very hard to know who you were fighting against, who was with their family, a farmer by the daytime, and at nighttime a soldier for the Viet Cong and the communist. Well, the United States is eventually going to leave Vietnam in 1973 without really making any progress. And just a couple of years later, South Vietnam is going to get overrun by the communists. So the war was kind of all for naught from the United States perspective. Well, the Soviet Union's going to do something similar in Afghanistan. They try to make Afghanistan a communist country, and they're going to fight a very long and bitter war. They're going to be there for about a decade. And the United States was sending rocket launchers and Stinger missiles to this rebel group called the Mujahideen. And so just one guy who knew how to use a rocket launcher could shoot a multi-million-dollar Soviet helicopter out of the sky. This proved very costly to the Soviet Union, and they're eventually going to have to retreat, very humiliated. But these Mujahideen that the US had aided actually are going to later go on and form the Taliban that's going to take over Afghanistan and take Afghanistan down a very dark path. Well, a new leader is going to take over the Soviet Union. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he's going to promote change. He promotes something called perestroika. This is restructuring, and glasnost, which means openness. And he says we've had enough of this over control from the government controlling every aspect of the economy. We need to step back and let the economy function. He says we need to not control all the news people are getting. There needs to be free sources of news information. And he says those countries in the Eastern Bloc, if they want to have revolutions and go their own way, that's fine. And that's what happened. Some of these countries were having these revolutions, and the Soviet army no longer stepped in to stop them. Well, in Germany, the Berlin Wall that had been put in by the Soviet Union in the 1960s to divide East and West Berlin because people were trying to escape East Berlin into the western side, it finally gets torn down. And this is a symbol of freedom emerging, the Soviet regime starting to move its way towards an end. Well, all these people in the different countries that had formed the Soviet Union, Russia, and then these other countries like the Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and so on, they all decided they didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. They wanted to go their own way. And so Russia forms their own government again for the first time. These other countries do as well. And eventually these governments start to supersede the importance of the Soviet government, which has one last coup to try to restore power, but ultimately gets defeated, and the Soviet Union comes to an end in the early 1990s. Well, China looked like maybe there was some similar hope there for a little while. They had many college students started a big uprising in Tiananmen Square, protesting against the government, asking for reforms and changes, but they ended up getting completely overblown by this reaction from the government that actually came in and killed many of the protesters. One man after the protest stood up against a tank, and this guy's kind of gone down in this mythos of this protest. But the Cold War effectively ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. But of course, we still have a few communist nations with us today.